Still with me in the studio, Caroline Rogers, Senior Associate in Tax at Edward Nathan Sonennbergs. We're talking about the Tax Administration Act on Mansfield's Money Sense, this particular show, and how it could affect you. I wasn't aware of it when it could have maybe affected me, but I'll tell you very briefly my little story, which happened last year. I think it was on the 21st or 22nd of December. And we happened to be in Scotland, and I was standing on the banks. Just imagine it now, Caroline.
Yes.
Right. Story time. Okay. We don't get much story time on CNBC Africa, but story time. Loch Ness in front of you. It's a grey and mizzly and misty day. And I said to my wife, this is the time to look carefully, because this is the perfect time and the perfect conditions for the monster to rise. And you know what?
It did.
The monster rose out of my pocket. My cell phone rang, and it was my private banker.
Yes.
To tell me that she'd been issued an order by SARS
Yes.
to clear out my current account. Bear in mind, I was overseas now over year end, and a lot of things come through for renewal at year end.
Mm-hmm.
So I topped up my current account, and that money was all gone like that.
Yep.
And I said to her, how can SARS do that? Surely they have no right. And she said, no, under the Banking Act, we are agents for SARS. And if we are instructed by them, they can't clear out your home loan, for example. But if your current account and any money you have that is free, they can take that away, which they did with me. It turns out, let's say I owed SARS 100 Rand. They took 15 Rand out of my account. It turns out that they actually owed me 24 Rand.
Yeah. Yeah.
They claimed I owed them 100.
Yeah.
But I just said to my wife, can you imagine somebody, I was very fortunate. I was able to re-top up from another account,
Sure.
that account,
Yeah.
to cover all of those overheads. But can you imagine a father who has saved up money for his children's Christmas presents, and 3 nights before Christmas his bank account is cleared out? I thought it was callous. And all that I was told was that I was sent a letter, which I never received.
Yeah.
And they made a phone call and left a message at my office, which I didn't receive.
Sure.
Those are the only 2 things they had to do, and they could then clear out my account. Would this Tax Administration Act have helped me in any way there? Look, it's been resolved, thank goodness.
Unfortunately not. That's when I mentioned draconian powers earlier, there truly are draconian powers for recovery of tax. And as long as SARS has notified you through one of the methods of delivery stipulated in the Act, which is, say, postal delivery or electronic email delivery at the last known address, they are deemed to have notified you of the assessment.
You see, I don't mind if an assessment comes up and I am liable for it, and I am forewarned. But in a country where the postal system is notoriously bad, I find it very one-sided that SARS can simply say, well, we sent you a letter.
Yeah. And, you know, as I said, as soon as the assessment is made and you are notified of the assessment, there's a tax debt due to the state. And they can, in terms of the Tax Administration Act, appoint your banker as your agent. That's called a withholding agent. And if the banker does not withhold from your account, they are liable for that tax. So that's why they have to. And there was actually a case on that there was a provision in the Income Tax Act, and there was a case called Henry v. Dedkor, and it was challenged. The constitutionality of that power that's granted to SARS was challenged, and it was held. It was a lower court decision. It wasn't a constitutional court decision, but the court did find that it was constitutional, because the interests of recovering tax was so important and for the efficient running of the state. And it does seem a lot of the cases, there have been a few challenges to these powers of SARS to recovery, and one of the best known case is a constitutional court case, Metcash, and the Constitution, that was in the context of VAT, and the Constitutional Court held that it was challenged, the pay now, argue later, and then in that specific case, there was a civil judgment. All SARS has to do in terms of another section is to swear that a specific statement of fact is correct, get it signed by the registrar. It doesn't need to go to court, and that's a civil statement, and it has the effect of a civil judgment. So then your assets can be attached. And that was one of the provisions challenged. And the court said that it was constitutional, that it didn't deny a person access to the courts, and that it was provisional. It wasn't permanent while the dispute until the dispute was resolved. So it does seem quite unfair, but it has been challenged on a few occasions, and in our courts and overseas, the judiciary seems very reluctant to take away or infringe on the powers granted to SARS in the legislation to recover tax.
Well, I suppose you can understand that, because it's an argument as to what's more important, the state or the individual,
exactly.
which is, I think it's probably been the longest ongoing court case in various forms in the world since ad infinitum, time infinitum.
Yes.
So yeah, I can understand that. But what worries me is something you said earlier about SARS being able to, I didn't quite understand it, being able to swear to a statement.
Well, they can file a civil statement, say swearing that the facts are true.
Yeah.
So,
do they have to advise me that that's what they're doing?
They do actually. Thank you for asking that. They do, in terms of the Tax Administration Act, they now have to give you 10 business days notice.
Okay, because I suddenly thought I'm going to suddenly find, or somebody may, you're sitting at home watching TV and somebody's starting to take the TV and your decoder out of your lounge.
Yeah. Especially if you're watching CNBC, you don't want that to happen.
No, you don't. You don't need that to happen. So hold on to your decoder. Okay. There's obviously going to be ongoing battles around this, and there are going to be challenges that are mounted against it. And what would you, as a legal tax person, if you were going to argue 2 or 3 points here, what would you like to see changed in this existing piece of legislation?
Sure, that's a very good question. I think I would like the taxpayers' rights to also be expanded upon and amplified like SARS's rights have been, because there are many provisions where the taxpayer SARS's powers are limited in certain circumstances, but the taxpayer isn't granted. It doesn't seem like the taxpayer really is granted equivalent powers, which as it would maybe be problematic when the state needs to collect. So that is a very fine balance. So I would definitely want some provision dealing with the pay now, argue later, as you say, where a taxpayer, maybe more effort has to be made to contact the taxpayer before those steps are taken. But then again, SARS is dealing with millions and millions of people, so you've got to consider that burden against an individual's rights, as you said, boils down to. As I said, I think the tax ombudsman's decisions should be binding.
But hang on, I understand that SARS is dealing with millions of people, and there is a burden there. But I've got to look at SARS as a company.
Yes.
And say, well, your job is to extract value on behalf of your shareholders through this product, which happens to be you and I. And you have certain costs to company, as any company has. And one of those is your debtors. And chasing your debtors. That to me is a cost to company. So I would, as a taxpayer, I would expect that out of respect, if I have given the correct information to SARS, if I haven't given the correct information from a point of view of getting hold of me, But if I've furnished them with the correct information, the onus should be on them to prove that they have advised me and that I have received that advice. It's one thing throwing a letter in the post. It's another thing saying, hang on, we've got a receipt here saying, I have seen this and I accept it.
Registered post instead of just...
Exactly.
I understand what you're saying, yeah.
Okay. The recovery aspects of it. Anything else that you would like to see?
The recovery aspects, tax ombudsman's decisions to be binding, and also regarding the penalties. That's quite a strict provision. Especially, there are two types of penalties that can be imposed. There's the administrative non-compliance penalty, and then there's also the underestimation penalty. And the underestimation penalty can only be remitted in specific circumstances, which are very particular, and only one type of that penalty can be remitted. So the Commissioner's discretion has been limited significantly from what it was previously under the Income Tax Act. So I would grant the Commissioner a bit more discretion to waive penalties where the circumstances warrant it. In particular, you can only have this penalty waived where you've disclosed the arrangement or transaction to SARS before your return was submitted, and also you got an opinion from a legal advisor before the return was submitted.
It's also very difficult, though, to estimate in a lot of cases where people are working on commissions and those sort of things, where you don't know what's going to happen with business.
Exactly.
Going into your financial year as a provisional taxpayer, you're not sure what's going to happen.
Well, if you're talking about underestimation of provisional tax, that is quite complicated because now that's it's an administrative non-compliance penalty and an understated. It's two. So if you're looking at the administrative non-compliance side, and there's a fixed amount penalty and a percentage-based penalty, and that would be your percentage-based penalty for underestimation. The penalty is raised in terms of the Income Tax Act, paragraph 20 of the 4th schedule, but it's implemented, and SARS has to notify you and follow the procedures in the Tax Administration Act. So then that is quite beneficial in some ways if that specific provision in the Income Tax Act gives the Commissioner discretion. So for example, for the underestimation of provisional tax, the Commissioner can waive the penalty if he feels the estimate was calculated seriously and with no negligence or deliberate misstatements, and that it was a genuine calculation.
But as you've said before, and we've got to wrap up here now, as you've said before, you've got to go through all the processes with SARS before you will be able to approach the Ombudsman once the Ombudsman has been appointed.
Yes.
Okay. Caroline, I'll tell you one thing you have done. You give me a headache.